Hey, welcome back to Art and Science of AI, everyone. I'm your host, Nikhil. And
I'm Piyush.
so we're back after a long hiatus. We wrapped up season two over a year ago, and we are kickstarting season three of the Art and Science of AI. We've had a lot of changes in our lives and the way we're using AI since then, and we'd love to share all of that with you. Piyush, do you want to talk about some of your recent changes?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the biggest change is that I'm working at OpenAI now, and I feel like I have this podcast, you mainly, and like all the work that we've been doing together for the last 1.5 years. I attribute my being at OpenAI to all of that. So, yeah, that's the biggest change for me.
On my end as well, I've had a lot of changes. I had my first kid like 7 months ago, and that's been an awesome experience. And I'm also currently running my own AI startup where I'm helping companies implement and operationalize their own AI agents for various business workflows, and obviously heavily using Codex and a lot of other AI agent frameworks for that. And yeah, I'm looking forward to discussing all of that stuff in our upcoming episodes.
Yeah, actually, maybe we can talk a little bit about that. We both decided to start an AI startup, and like the idea was simple: is like bringing the power of AI to like small and medium businesses and help them transform their businesses. And I think we both came to the same conclusion sometime at the start of this year, is which is we were using all the different coding agents that are available, right? Code, Claude Code, Codex. And I think we both realized that Codex is really amazing, especially since the launch of 5.3 Codex, the model. And in fact, I was so inspired by that. I was like, man, I want to be at OpenAI, and decided to be at OpenAI. So, which is why we're also talking about Codex. Like we're both Codex build, if you will. And just the one thing I wanted to call out is like, of course, I work at OpenAI, so like my biases are going to be so apparent. So that's maybe like a disclaimer that we can have is like, of course, I work at OpenAI, and I'm like a big fan of Codex, and I'm gonna be talking a lot of things from the OpenAI perspective. So maybe one role you can play is like keep that in check a little bit so that it doesn't get a little bit annoying. And plus, for my own knowledge, I feel like I'm so immersed in like the OpenAI ecosystem, like what the reason I'm also looking forward to like season three is so that you can help me, round off my perspective on like, oh, Piyush, this thing, not that only OpenAI is doing thing. Here are some other players who are
Yeah,
doing something similar. So that's
absolutely.
like good for my own knowledge as well.
I am a huge fan of vendor neutrality. I like really hate having vendor lock in to any proprietary tools or ecosystems. I actually recently switched my main computing environment to Linux, and we can talk about that some other time. But yeah, I've been playing around with all the different AI agent harnesses and AI agent frameworks. So on the coding agent harnesses side, there's Open Code and Pi and Claude Code and Codex. I've been playing around with all of those. And then there's also the user-facing agent harnesses like OpenClaw and Hermes and others. And I think like Codex actually is at a weird intersection right now where it started as a developer-facing tool that was playing the same role as like Claude Code and Open Code. And now it's kind of with Codex Desktop, especially, it's moving a lot further up the stack to just normal end user productivity use cases. And I think that that's something we should talk about. That's been one of the more exciting things to see in terms of Codex recent developments. But yeah, I started like last year, I think, when we were both talking about this. Like we discovered Claude Code, both of us, and we'd been using it like crazy for a very long time. That was the first like developer facing AI agent that really showed us the power of agentic AI for coding as opposed to just like autocomplete and stuff. And I was using that pretty much exclusively, also switching to some open source tools. But I think when GPT 5.2 the Codex version came out, that was like early this year, maybe January or February. That's when I switched to Codex, and their subscription plan has been very generous and great as well. So yeah, that was the. I think it was around the same time when you also switched to using Codex, and this was even before you joined OpenAI.
Maybe we should share this is we both were working on a project where we're trying to make some AI agents for a hospice, and we're doing this pro bono just to like get a sense of how to build AI agents, how AI agents actually work in a real environment, and how they can transform some businesses. And we're working on this donor management agent, and we're using all these different subscriptions, Claude Code, Open Code, and Codex. And I think for me, the moment was when 5.3 Codex, the Codex specific model had launched. And now OpenAI has moved to like just one model being also the general purpose model and the coding model. But I think when they had the specific coding specific model, 5.3 Codex, for me, that was the moment that I realized, okay, now this has crossed over to a point where I can reliably assume that whatever request I make of Codex is like, okay, I want this particular code. It will do it reliably. So for in my mind, I was like, oh wow, this is like the spreadsheet moment for agents. And what I mean by that is like if you were to talk about how Microsoft Excel changed the world, like we can spend like maybe 10 podcast episodes on it. Like just like
Wait,
the
actually,
there was
let's just pause for a moment and step back. So you actually, let me set this up and you can continue with this. You last week you
yeah.
shared a video with me titled "A Love Letter to Codex," and it was amazing. You talked about the ways in which you love Codex and especially the desktop app, and it actually converted me to using the Codex desktop app. Prior to this, I was exclusively using the command line tool Codex CLI, and because that's how I used all of my coding agents. But then after watching your video, like which was almost 2 weeks ago now, I became inspired to switch to the Codex desktop app, and I've been using that exclusively for like the past 2 weeks. I just haven't been using the terminal at all. So I would like to spend some time talking about your conversion moment, your video, A Love Letter to Codex, and what like impact that had for you and what motivated you to write or make a video essay on A Love Letter to Codex.
Yeah, so for me, the conversion moment, like I said, was when the 5.3 Codex model had launched within Codex, and I was like, wow, this thing just always works. You can one shot anything you want, and this is amazing. So, and the reason I made that video, a love letter to Codex, is like I was already Codex pilled, if you will, if the word like this. So a month in, I ended up on this internal Codex user leaderboard on like position number one. Basically, I used the most Codex in my entire org, like within the GTM org that I'm in. And a
Hmm.
lot of people were asking me, "Is like, hey man, what are you doing with it? Like, what are some of your workflows?" And you know, I had very practical conversations with my colleagues on like, oh, these are the workflows I'm using it for, and this is how I use it for work, and this is how I use the features. But like what inspired me to make the video like a love letter to Codex is I was reflecting myself as like, why have I been using it so much? And like I came to the usual conclusions that it's helped me massively unlock my productivity, increase my velocity. But then at the root of it all was something very simple and basic. It's just like I've like fallen in love with it and I just want to use it all the time. I think the reason why Codex is so good is because the harness that powers it so good. So maybe this would be a good time for us to, parse out what these things are. So, Nikhil, do you want to talk a little bit about like what is a harness? This word is like maybe the word of the moment, right? Everyone's talking about harness. People are talking about
Yeah.
harness engineering.
Yeah, let's talk about this a little bit, I guess, because the words agent and harness get thrown around a lot and different people use them to mean different things. But maybe a simple way of looking at it is in terms of like foundational building blocks, and we can go level by level. So let's say level zero, the most foundational building block of all of this is just sending a prompt to an LLM and getting a response back. So let's call that level zero. And this is basically what the ChatGPT app was like when it first launched, like in 2023, I think, and when all the initial AI chat applications launched, that was level zero. So you just send a prompt to the LLM, and then based on the LLM's own training data, it produces a response. And then I would say the next level, level one beyond that, is introducing what's called the agentic loop, which includes tool calling. So at that point, it's not just the LLM producing a response, but the LLM has a set of tools that it can use. So maybe like a really simple thing is it might have a calculator tool and it might have a weather tool to get like the weather. So if you ask it a question about adding numbers, and LLMs are typically not good at adding and multiplying numbers, it'll know to call the calculator tool, or like if you want to know the weather, it'll call the weather tool. So that's the next level, the agentic tool calling loop. And Initially, so today, when you go onto the ChatGPT app or any other AI app, it's already on this agentic level where it's not just producing LLM responses, it's doing tool calling. And then one level above that is where you might start to use the word like harness, which is wrapping agentic tool calling in another layer of abstraction that handles things like your session state, the state of the conversation, what like skills can be loaded into the context, like how memories are managed and things like that. So that's typically the level at which people call something a harness. And then I would say there's one level even beyond that, which is a full AI agent framework in some sense, which is what things like OpenClaw and Hermes try to do, where they combine this with like channels for messaging and like you have a messaging gateway. And there are ways in which you can have multiple agents like coordinating with each other. So I would say like these are the different levels, and Codex right now is probably at that level 2 where it's beyond the agentic tool calling and it's a harness that can orchestrate work for you.
Dude, that is
Does
like
that make sense?
beautifully explained. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I feel like that's like a very beautiful explanation. I think that's also a good blueprint for like all the things that we will be discussing in this season or in our future episodes, right? Like these are things that we're very interested in. But like to come back to Codex and to like the point you were making is like the thing that orchestrates this agentic loop and manages tool calling. So the reason I wrote a love letter and the fact that I'm in love with Codex so much is it's just it always works. Like because when I use it at work, I am not a software engineer. I work at OpenAI in the GTM function, so I am what you would call a knowledge worker. And it's just so good even for knowledge work because a lot of times you have to gather contacts, make presentations, write emails and stuff. So you want that reliability that I discovered when I was writing code with Codex, and it just always works. And I think the reason it always works, and it's why I always look forward to using it, why I'm in love with it, is because the way it manages all these complicated things like tool calling, memory, compaction, caching, is just it just makes everything work. So that has been one primary
Can you
reason that
maybe
I've
give one or two specific examples of like the kind of things you're using the Codex desktop app for that you really love?
Yeah, for sure. So maybe I can talk a little bit about like what I do at a high level, and that'll give you some intuitions in the way I use it. So like I said, I work in GTM, right? So I work with a lot of large customers, and I try to help them identify newer use cases that they can build on top of with AI and transform their businesses, and also help them deploy those use cases using our model. So, anyways, I work with like a set of 4 or 5 customers. So when I work with these customers, I like talk to anywhere between 10 to 20 people at the customer, right? And then I have many different conversations. I have to understand their business deeply. So basically I have to manage a lot of context, and then I'm plugged into like anywhere between 5 to 10 different Slack channels. So and it can be a lot of overwhelming work and context management, not in the AI sense, but context management in your own human head. So the way
Hmm.
I use Codex, one of the things I do is I have one durable thread for every customer that I work with that
Mm.
runs with heartbeat automations at a regular interval. So what that heartbeat automation does basically is every hours or 2 hours, it will go into and look into all the different Slack channels that I have for that given customer, my email, internal Slack channels to monitor if there's any new product announcement or anything relevant. And every time it runs, it then has some durable files that captures the context about that customer. And the hope is to have those durable files have the same context about that customer that lies in my head. So what I'm trying to do at a high level is
Mm.
whatever context I have at any given moment about any one of my customer, my Codex should also have. So I'm trying to create Codex as literally my second brain. And once I can ensure that, like when my durable threads do it, then the magic unlocks. Because after that, let's say I'm in a meeting, right? And
So
one of my
it's almost
customers,
like you have your own employees reporting to you, and you made like these Codex employees almost, and each employee is like responsible for one customer, and you basically given this employee a bunch of context about the customer and given the employee some procedures to go and get more information from other sources like your internal communications platform, which is Slack and various documents. It sounds like that's the kind of setup you're making.
Yeah, that's very right. In fact, the way I like thinking about it is instead of just an employee, like it's my chief of staff. I think that's the right way of thinking about it. So it's basically, so I was going to like the magic that it unlocks. Every morning, I have a morning brief on like, hey, Piyush, these are the important things that you need to keep on top of mind. Or at any given point of time, I will be like, hey, what are the things I should be working on right now? And basically, for me to answer that question, what would I do? At any given point of time, we're busy people, right? Like we have like 10,000 things we could do, but it's really hard to know what to prioritize. So like Codex can do that for me. It will go into my calendar and understand how much time I have, what are things that are pressing. So because it has all the context, it literally acts as my chief of staff. So what's really cool is you can use Codex as your chief of staff and you can just massively unlock your productivity because you have this thing on your side who knows the same context that lies on your head and can help you plan and execute. So like that's the right way of thinking about it. It's like an employee or a chief of staff.
So, but you have like a chief of staff, but you also have like individual. You don't think of every thread as your chief of staff, right? Probably there's some threads that you think of as your chief of staff threads, and then you have the individual threads that you have per client or whatever. Those are like lower level employees in some way that are
Yeah,
focused on
it's as if my chief of staff had like 4 people or 5 people reporting to them, and like they were always like imagine if there was literally a human whose job was to always monitor the situation. You know, there's a funny meme on Twitter like
yeah.
monitoring the situation. So imagine if you had like these little workers who are always monitoring the situation on any given particular domain. So I work in GTM, I work with customers, that could be it. But you can think of something similar for product managers, right? Like there's one monitoring the
Yeah,
situation employee for like and
these are common across different functions and industries. I think this is exactly the kind of like agents and automations that I'm seeing my clients need and what I'm deploying for them.
I was just going to add one last thing to round this off is I use the word heartbeat automations and I use it for a very
Hmm.
specific reason. And I think the analogy that you used about it being an employee is the exact right analogy here. And I think the only way it works is if you use heartbeat automation. And maybe if you don't mind, I can take like 2 minutes to parse out what are heartbeat automations and why they're different from normal automations using the same analogy that you use of like a employee.
Yeah,
So, I mean, this is now well known that the creator of OpenClaw, Peter Steinberger, he's now at OpenAI, and one of the most amazing things that I liked about OpenClaw is this idea of heartbeat automation. So let's understand like what a normal automation is. So a normal automation or any normal cron job is where you schedule a new instance of an LLM to do something on your behalf. And because the new instance of the LLM has no context into what you're doing, it is your responsibility to orient it and give it all the context. So in the case of my example and the way I use it, using the same analogy as the employee, imagine if so right now I have one employee for every one of the customers that I manage or the partners that I manage, right?
hmm,
Imagine if every day, instead of having the same employee, I was working with this temp agency who would send me a new temp every morning. So every morning I would get a new temp. And for this new temp to get oriented and like always monitor the situation, I would have to give it context every day. It's like, hey, so this is the customer you're working. Here
yeah,
are all the Slack channels that you have to monitor. And every morning, and any learning that I have to bring to it, I have to make sure that I capture those learnings. And the next step, I give it those learnings. The heartbeat automation is really cool, is it works more intuitively. It's like if you have an employee who's monitoring the situation, the next time they're monitoring the situation or the next schedule of their automation, they should carry forward the context of the previous run and any learnings they had from the previous run. So now let me step back from the analogies because analogies are only useful to an extent. And the way it works in reality is when you have a schedule automation, that runs within the same thread. It's called a heartbeat automation. And what I mean by the same thread is, let's say you have one conversation that's going on. in Codex, that's a thread, but it's a similar primitive for others as well, right? Like when you have a conversation going on in Claude Code or in Open Code, you can call it a thread. Now, when you have an automation that runs on a given thread or it is pinned to a given thread, that's called a heartbeat automation. And the reason why it's such a powerful primitive is because let's look at this. Let's say it ran once and it swept slacks for that customer across all the different channels, and it uncovered that they want pricing on some new OpenAI feature, right? Let's take a normal
Hmm.
example. Now, when it runs the next time, let's say the next hour, it already has context of that. And now maybe the next run, it can like specifically check if they got an answer to that pricing question or if there are any internal channels where that pricing information might be possible, right? So that's really the power of a heartbeat automation is every successive run carries forward the context of the previous run, and that's where it becomes really powerful, like a heartbeat automation compared to a normal automation where every successive run is kind of like a new run. So you have like amnesia about all previous runs. Does that make sense on like what a heartbeat automation is
Yeah. That
compared
that
to a
totally makes
normal automation?
sense. Actually, when I build these kinds of automations for clients, this is one of the most challenging things is how to preserve the context. And I'm not doing it in this way of keeping it all in a thread, but you usually have to think about how to write the output of what was previously done to a specific location. Like you would have to have some logs, and then you have to think about what kind of persistent memory you want to write. And there's pretty complex architecture that you would have to build to make something like this happen. But I guess today, for everyday users, it's pretty simple to do if you just go to the Codex Desktop app and start a thread and start an automation within that. Like, you don't have to like think about all the context engineering that goes on in the back end. Maybe unless you graduate to being like a power user or you have some very specific requirements, then you might want to manage that more. But I think that actually is really the beauty of Codex, and specifically the Codex desktop app for me is it's taking all of these features that only like power users would have access to, which required doing a lot of like context engineering and setting up the right agents and skills where, you would need some expert to implement that for you. And that's a large part of what I'm doing. But now this is becoming easier for end users with like the Codex desktop app. And I think Claude is trying to do something similar with Claude Cowork. And I think we're going to see more and more of these like end user productivity facing tools coming out. And I think Codex desktop apps implementation of it is particularly really cool.
Actually, I wanna hear more about that. So I don't want it to seem like I'm like trading my book, and obviously I'm really passionate about Codex, and but I'm also very curious. Like you have been such a heavy CLI user, and now you're using the Codex app. So like what you said about like it managing all the different context engineering stuff that you had to do earlier. But what are like some other reasons that finally made you decide to switch to like a desktop flavor from CLI? And like, what was your workflow like earlier? What are
Yeah.
you
So
using the
for
Codex desktop
me,
app on now?
like I was totally living in the terminal, I would say, for the past year or so, because the coding agent apps were terminal based apps like Claude Code, Open Code, all of them. And then I found that that's actually the like best way to work with your agents if like the stuff you're doing is also in the terminal. So then I had a bunch of like I used to use a terminal based editor called NeoVim, which I still use sometimes if I want to go and edit files. But a few transformations I think happened. One is that the things that coding agents can do as they get more and more powerful, like they need to come out of the terminal because the terminal UI is not really great for it's good for just reviewing and editing text maybe even for that it's actually not great. Like you would see like Claude Code famously had this like weird flickering thing where it would just flow so much text onto the terminal that it would start like bugging out. And I think the terminal just
Yeah.
wasn't meant for writing these kinds of applications, and people had to hack various ways to get it to work in the terminal. So that's one is just like a better UI, I think. And Codex brings everything into one place. It has like your conversation, it has an inbuilt terminal, it has an inbuilt like file browser. and it has an in-app browser as well. So if you're developing any like web applications, it can automatically load a preview of the browser and look at that. So this is the other thing. So that's one, is like it actually provided a good UI. The second is it provides a good feedback loop to your agents, because a lot of times when you edit code with a coding agent, then you have to go to like your browser or wherever that application is deployed and do something like take a screenshot and then pass it back to your coding agent. And there are like some MCP servers and skills that can automate that using like Playwright and Agent Browser and things like that. But it was still a clunky experience, because what the agent was doing and looking at is kind of obscure to you. It uses some CLI tool to go and log into the browser and take a snapshot. So one of the coolest features of the Codex Desktop app is this in-app browser, where it opens up a browser next in the side panel. And then if you're developing a web app or anything like that, like it will actually show you the steps that it's going through, and you can like look at the same thing that your agent is looking at. So I think that's another important thing, that you have good shared context with the agent. Like what you're looking at and what the agent or is looking at is the same. And they have this cool feature where you
Can
can
I
like
add can
annotate.
I add one
Yeah, yeah.
can I just add one thing to the in-app browser thing? I think what you said is exactly right. But I'm not sure if you've explored this, but there is actually a feature where once your app's front end loads into that in-app browser, you can actually comment on specific components on that and be like, hey, like this part, can you change it to green? Which is, I think, such a
Oh
cool
yeah.
way of interacting with your agent, because like instead of just prompting in text in a text box, you can now prompt into the actual UI, right? Like, which is a better, more symbiotic feedback loop with your agent, to your point earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the point I was just about to mention, which is the annotations feature. And it often is just so difficult to describe an image to your agent and say that, hey, look at this image and look at this part of the image where this is happening and fix that. And with this, you just have a visual way. So I think the other thing is just the image capabilities of the models have gotten better. So uh, a lot of the work we're doing with agents is not just text based now, it's like image based and like viewing, entire browser UIs and things like that. So the desktop app is really good for that. And then the last feature, which I think is really awesome, is computer use. And that there's a sub variant of computer use, which is the Chrome browser use, actually, which you can add a plugin in your Chrome browser and give access to Codex to that. And then, so this is different than the in-app browser. The in-app browser is for things like testing applications you're building and stuff. The Chrome browser plugin is for like if you wanted to interact with websites that you're interacting with. Like, so suppose I'm logged into my Gmail or a messaging app or something like that on the Chrome browser, then I can just tell Codex app to go use Chrome, like read my emails, summarize them. And so this is for the productivity and everyday tasks. Actually, one cool like use case I put it to was I was developing a OpenClaw multi-agent setup for which I was like, hey, I need a Discord server where I'm going to create different Discord channels. And each OpenClaw agent will be on one of these channels and they have different permissions, etc. And I just made the plan with Codex and I said, hey, first go implement the code, which is the configuration of the OpenClaw agent. And then second, go to Chrome and actually set this up using the Chrome UI and go set up the Discord server and the channels and the bot and everything. And it's a little buggy at times, but it did get the job done at the end of the day. And also the one con is that this has very high token usage right now. If you're
Yeah.
doing a lot of like image processing and computer use stuff, like you'll run through your codex rate limits like much faster. But it's like a really cool capability. There are some things, some ideas I had for like personal applications I wanted to build, which I was never able to do because they require a lot of like manual like computer use. Like one simple example I'll give you is that I have for a long time wanted to build some kind of personal data pipeline that takes all the personal data I have from various cloud services I use and create my own personal context database so that like my agents will have a lot more context about like my life. So for example, I want to give it access to things like, hey, what's my Gmail history, my Google Calendar history, like Google Photos, some like Google Maps data, so I can know like where I visited, like maybe like Amazon shopping history, social media messaging history, and things like that. And with all of these services, it's actually really hard to get. There's no API, first of all, that gives you the data that you need. So you have to go into various like browser interfaces. So for Google, they have this thing called Google Takeout, or with Amazon, you have to go to some place that says export your data, and then you have to click a button and download a zip file. And I was like, man, there's no way to automate this. But now with computer use, I'm actually trying to set up an automation that just runs on my computer. And it's like, hey, go to all these different services, click the export buttons, download the data, and process it using this pipeline. So that kind of stuff
Yeah, and
just wasn't possible
see, I
before.
mean, like building on this, like you are, I would say, a power user of these AI agents, and you were facing all these problems that the computer use agent has solved for you. But I think one thing we both also discovered working with a lot of small businesses is that they don't have access to the kind of tooling that have readily available API endpoints or CLI
Hmm.
tools that your agent can use. Sometimes they just use tooling software systems that have been developed like 10, 20 years back. They don't have any APIs, but these are deeply integrated into their existing way of things. So your AI agentic solution or any automation that you're doing for these small businesses shouldn't require them to switch over from what they already know, but somehow integrate with what they already know and are comfortable using. And I feel like computer use agent, however token intensive they are amazing for that type of capability where it can do some work for them and like integrate with basically virtually any system that you have access to with your computer. And one thing I've been thinking about is just like on this computer agent, it is kind of buggy right
One
now.
tip
Like
on the token usage, or one point that I just want to make, is that right now the token usage is very high, but this is going to come down over time
I,
as the models
dude, we're
get better and cheaper.
we're
And
like in
actually, even right now,
sabbaticals.
I often delegate like a lot of my computer use tasks to GPT 5.4 mini, because I found that
Yeah,
it's actually, because the computer use tasks are not that complex. It's just doing a bunch of
right,
image processing, and it's often smart enough
right.
to do that stuff. So it saves a lot of
Yeah, like
tokens. And
dude,
I'm
you
sure
and
in
I are in
future.
complete You were in complete sync. That's exactly what I was gonna say. I was gonna say like when I said like it's a little buggy right now. That's what I meant. Like I actually call even it being token intensive buggy, and that's exactly what I was saying. You can use the lowest reasoning for these models, and they'll be relatively more token efficient. And the point is where it's headed in the future. Like it's gonna be a lot cheaper, and like you won't have to worry about like this being a special token intensive use case. And what like the point I was trying to also make is imagine that future where your agent can basically use your computer. And I would highly recommend that whoever's listening to this podcast episode actually download either Codex or Claude Code or whatever agent can use their computer use. It's called Kua or computer use agent, and watch that thing in action because I think it's a very inspiring moment. And it's a moment where you might get what some people call being AGI pill, where you will truly realize the power of these systems is to see your computer's mouse move in the real world and like click on applications on your window. And the reason why it's such a powerful moment, and I want everyone to experience that moment, is because like think about it. At the end of the day, you might be a person who like earns let's say $100,000 a year or $500,000 a year or $5 million a year. Most modern humans, the way they work is they all go to their offices or their home offices, they open their laptops or their desktop, and they like type a bunch of things into a bunch of applications and they move their mouse around, right? At the end of the day, that's what you're doing. And if the agent can now move your mouse around and type a bunch of things on your keyboard, if it's smart enough, then it can, and if it has enough context or the same context that lies in your head, it can potentially do a lot of the work that you can. And I don't mean it as like a way of replacing humans, but as a way of showing like the power of these things. Like these things can now actually move the mouse around and use your keyboard and like type a bunch of things. So practically speaking, there is very little that stops them from doing what you do. So I want people to experience this because this is a very inspiring moment, and it's a moment which will actually give you an intuition for how capable these things have got and how much more capable these things will get and like the implications those things will have. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is something, first of all, yes, everyone should experience this. Go download any kind of application that lets you do computer use and give it a simple task like that you would do. Tell it, like, open up a Word document and write this, or go open up the browser and open my email and do this and that. And I think just experiencing that is really cool. But one actually like challenge I've been facing, and this is a really hard problem, which I think no one has yet solved, and I've been thinking about it a lot, is how to think about like identity, authentication, and like security for what your AI agents are doing, especially when you get into things like computer use and doing things on your behalf. And I've been experimenting with like two different approaches to this. One is treating the agent as an extension of myself and like thinking of it as like acting on my behalf. So when I use the Codex Desktop app, it just is using my computer, which is already open. So then anything it's doing, it's kind of doing on my behalf. So like it might go into my Gmail account and download some stuff. Like I said, this automation I'm planning to build depends on like going into my accounts and doing all this stuff, right? And that is one way to use it, but this comes with like a lot of security risks, I would say, because I'm still not fully confident in like giving the agent a task that involves going into my Google and Amazon accounts, especially like deep in the settings and doing the data exports. Because if just something goes wrong, what if it clicks like, hey, delete this instead of like download this? Or there are any number of things that could go wrong there. So that's one way in which you could use it as an extension of yourself, but that comes with some risks. The other way in which you can use it is as an assistant. And that's how I use agents like OpenClaw and Hermes. Like they don't run on my computer, they run on a separate server that I have. And I don't give them access to any of my credentials. Instead, I make their own accounts for them. So I made its own GitHub account, its own like email account. And then I share access with it in the way that I would if I had a human assistant. So, for example, I give it access to my GitHub projects through the access sharing feature in GitHub. And so that's
Yeah.
a more isolated model, and it's safer, but then it's also less powerful because if I keep restricting what it can access, then it can't do as much for me. So this kind of the challenge I've been facing is one is about like how much access to give it, like give it read and write access to everything versus very limited. And the second is how to think about its identity. Like should it be doing things like on my behalf, or like should it have its own identity and own accounts and
Yeah.
stuff? And
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Dude,
don't know
I
if
think
that's
I think
something
you
you've been
raised.
thinking about.
Yeah, no, what I have to think about these things all the time because I work with large enterprises, right? And these controls are even more important for them because not that I'm saying that your Amazon or Gmail stuff getting deleted isn't a big deal, but at their scale, it's like it could have billions of dollars in impact in revenue or trust with their customers if something goes wrong. So I think like I was saying, right? Like there's like a nice blueprint for all the discussions that I want to have with you through this podcast and like going all the way from like just using the LLMs or like the responses API to like building up the stack. And I think one thing we should do is like deep dive into these things. There's this idea of sandboxing that's really popular. How do you do identity management, authentication? Specifically for the Codex app, I would say there's a really cool feature called auto review. I love that feature. I think the way that it's elegantly designed is amazing, where like there is another agent that actually looks at what the your main agent needs access to and intelligently figures out what it should auto approve versus where it should flag you. But I want to step back and maybe take like a higher level philosophical approach, and maybe that would be a good place to end our conversation. Is it also kind of depends on your own risk appetite, personality, and how trusting you are with these agents, because one thing you might have noticed is like it may making some people nervous is like, what, this guy is he driving? He seems to be sitting on the driver's seat. I see a little bit of the steering wheel and he's having this video podcast, and I do see like stuff moving around. Like, is he the mad person? Like, what is he look? So like, to give you the context, I drive a Tesla, and I have the Juniper Model Y, and the reason I love it so much is it has full self driving, and I subscribe to the full self driving, and basically my car drives itself. Now, if you think about it, it's kind of a crazy thing that I'm doing, right? I am literally trusting my life with this AI agent. Fundamentally, FSD is an AI agent, and I would say an AI agent like which does things in the real world, because like what is an AI agent, right? It is things that can make an LLM do things as opposed to like say things. So I am obviously on the other side of the spectrum where I'm like completely trusting my life with this AI agent. Like, what if it like decides to your point about like deleting file? Like, what would be the equivalent of deleting files? Is like, boom, like it just like goes on the wrong side, crashes. But I'm kind of trusting my life with it because I have confidence in its ability to not do that and be safe, because I've done my due diligence and I know how these things work under the hood. So an equivalent of that would be like some people just YOLOing and going into like dangerously skip permissions and like giving their agent access to literally everything that they can and like not restricting it anyway. Versus I know that there are a lot of people who just don't like OpenClaw or Hermes or those types of agents because they're just too risky. So I think it's a matter of personal philosophy. Different agents or different architectures have different ways of solving it. So I would say this is something that is not just top of mind for you, but is top of mind for literally every single company. And as you're building an AI automation business that will be working with a lot of different types of customers, it's an important discussion to have. And I would like to
Yeah.
go deep into it and like figure out the
I
various
actually
ways
really
people are
like
thinking about solving.
your self-driving car analogy. And I think one concept that's useful to borrow from there is what's called levels of autonomy. And in the
Right.
self-driving ecosystem, they have like L1, L2. So do you know what your Tesla's classification is? Like L2, I
I think
think, right?
technically it's anywhere between 2.5 and 3. They say 2.5 because it's still supervised, which
Okay.
is why like I keep looking at the road, and I look at you, but I look at the road as well. Even though literally in the last 2 months since I've owned this car, I have not touched the steering wheel even once. It just seamless, door to door. Like this is a good example. Like I've not like I've not interacted with the
Yeah.
mechanism of driving at all, and it's a
But
pleasurable
you're
drive. But
still sitting at the driver's seat, ready to take over at any moment. Like, unlike, like a true level 3 vehicle, which is like a Waymo, which I've gone in where when you get in the car, you go sit in the back seat and you're not ready to
right.
take over. So, and there's also like a different level of autonomy where maybe you're not even in the car and you're like, hey, I'm just sending the car to go pick up something from my friend's house and get it. So, but the general conceptual framework of there are different levels of autonomy, and each level of autonomy corresponds to like a level of trust that I'm willing to put into the agent, I think is a good framework. And as we build AI agents, I think people should think about what level of autonomy they're comfortable giving to this agent. And it could be different for different people. Maybe the same agent, for me, I'm like, hey, this is good for L2. Someone else may be like, no, this is a L1 for me. But like this kind of
Right.
framework, I think, is helpful. And then having some kind of review system where you have maybe different levels of review corresponding to different levels of like autonomy and trust.
I think that's a great way of looking at it. I wonder if like these systems are classified as. If not, then maybe you should. Like, I think it's a great analogy and a great way of
I
bringing
think
over
it's
something
not
from the
possible
self-driving
to
world.
do this because it's too general purpose. Like in self driving, the domain of what the AI agent is doing is pretty limited to like, hey, I have to drive a car from point A to point B. And there's very clear answers for what constitutes a mistake or something going wrong. But in open ended, like, coding, knowledge worker, productivity type tasks, it's much more open ended. But I don't know, maybe there could be some kind of like framework that would be really interesting.
I think one other thing we should do, just building on what you said, is like I have so many ideas on things that I would like to explore with you. One other thing we should do is just like parse out the difference between what a general purpose AI is versus a domain specific
Yeah.
AI like Tesla. They're equally powerful. Like one could make an argument that right now maybe the Tesla
Yeah.
self driving is the most impressive AI agent, but it's a domain specific AI versus like a Claude
Yeah.
Code or Codex. It's a general purpose agent. So I think it's worth getting into like how they're different, like how the ML pipelines are different and like how they're built and what their usage is. But yeah, man, like this has been such a fun conversation. I'm glad we did this, and I have like so many things I want to talk to you about. Like I have so many questions in my mind. So like the way we started off this podcast was literally me just being super curious about these things around AI, and you helping me understand it. And just to close this out where we started, and the reason why I attribute this podcast and you and to all the work that we've been doing over the last 1.5 years to my being at OpenAI is because like this podcast and you literally helped me understand these things from the ground up. So I'm even more excited to explore these things with you because as this technology is evolving, like I have so many more questions. Like I want to understand so many more things that we talked about today, but like so many things we didn't even touch on today are all happening and all things so exciting. So man, I'm like so happy we're starting again, and I think this mode works well for me. Like I'm anyways driving or being driven in the morning. I usually listen to music or a podcast, so it'll be great as opposed to listening to a podcast. Like making one is just a conversation between two buddies. Yeah, hope people like it. Like, do you have any ending thoughts, Nikhil?
No, I think I'm also looking forward to our upcoming conversations. And yeah, thanks to everyone in the audience who's still here and listening. Please drop us some comments. Let us know what you'd like to hear more or less of, and we'll try to adjust accordingly. All right. Well, that's it for this episode. Bye, everyone.
Everyone.